You know, Jesus in this conversation that we've been talking about this month in Matthew chapter 23, he starts out and he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to those whom he knows rather well. There's others in the audience. And in verse 13, he transitions his attention to those specific people in the audience. He offers 7 woes. And really he's saying, in my first coming, in me being here in front of you, I've observed some things about you. Woe to you. Here's your time to get it right before my second coming. He's made observations during his first coming, and he says, you need to deal with this, or at my second coming, there'll be issues. And so that compels us to think about Judgment Day as it pertains to this conversation that Jesus is having with this group of people. And I've observed this concerning Judgment Day. There will be 2 groups of people. There will be one group of people on that day that receive that which they deserve. And there will be another group of people who receive that for which they are so unworthy. Which group of people do you find yourself in? The group that's going to make sure you're worthy? Or the group that recognizes how unworthy you really are? That was the issues that the Pharisees had at their core. They wanted to earn everything. They wanted what they perceived to be theirs. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Because you create rules that I never created. You create issues that I never intended to be amongst the people. You adhere to ideas that I never put in your mind. And you've shut yourself out of the kingdom. He goes on to say in verse 23, the subject matter for which we've been talking this month. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. At the end of our discussion, I want to spend time and I want to answer the question, why was it heavier? There were heavier aspects of the law that they were not willing to deal with. What made those aspects of the law heavier? But I think before we get to that, we need to ask ourselves some question about the text that is here in front of us. The first question is, who is the audience? I want us to have an understanding of that group of people that he's talking to. What was wrong with their perspective? They were religious, and many of the activities that they consumed their time with were good. But what was wrong with their perspective? And where was their trust? Who was the audience? Who was he talking to when he said, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees? They had rather he just addressed them in that manner. Scribes and Pharisees. He added his outlook on that group of people. Hypocrites. But who were they? They were the most well-read and studied of religious society. They were the most noticeably religious of the day, whether it were by their prayers on the street corners, or what they wore, or who they associated with. They were the most noticeably religious of the day. And they were the standard for religion. They were the standard. So much so that when Paul wanted to get their attention when he would write letters, he would say, "A Pharisee of Pharisees." I was at the top. And when he used that as a part of his resume, only to catch the attention of his audience, they knew what he meant. As I look at that, it reminds me of a group of people that if we're not careful that we can become. And we can pride ourselves on being the most well-read and studied, the most religiously well-rounded group of people, and certainly the standard. That's whose attention he had this day. They had the completely wrong perspective. And what's interesting about the context of what we're dealing with in chapter 23 is this is no new issue for Jesus. He started his ministry in chapter 5 and 6 of Matthew with the Sermon on the Mount. He concludes that in chapter 7. He's at the onset of getting across to them this idea of what it means to be a part of the kingdom. He's now been a part of the ministry, and he's been working for some 3 years, and he still has the same issues with this group of people. He says of them in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before others." What was wrong with their perspective? They were doing it for all the wrong reasons, which was in order to be seen. They were doing religious activities in order to be seen. "For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." They had a problem with seeing that which is unseen. And because they could not see God, they pleased those whom they could see. And the religious focus in their mind was not on God, but upon others, and what others would think of them, and the esteem of which others would have concerning them. And unfortunately, this perspective and this mindset did not die with the Pharisees. Satan still uses this same perspective and mindset today to warp us and take the focus away from Jehovah God, who deserves all praise, and put it on ourselves and what others may perceive about us. Continuing on in the Sermon on the Mount, he would say this, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites." We know who he's talking about when he speaks of the hypocrites. He tells us he's speaking of the scribes and the Pharisees, "For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward." What did we open up with concerning the day of judgment? There will be those who are going to receive that which is due them. The scribes and the Pharisees thought they were deserving. And Jesus says, "Oh, you are, and you'll get that from man. But know this, because you've received it from man, it shall be withheld from you by God. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go in your room and shut the door. Pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Their perspective had been warped and had been focused on the flesh. It had been focused on what they could see, and they took pride in what they could see and what they could show others about themselves. And it warped their perspective. Where was their trust? Where was their trust? Their trust is in what they could do. He tells them, "You tithe and mint and dill and cumin." You know what David says when he's caught up in that sin with Bathsheba? He struggles with this and he says, "I want to earn my way back into your mercies and your good favor, God." But he says, God, I can't do enough. I cannot do enough. He says in the 51st Psalm, he writes this, for you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. I read in this through the passion and emotion that he writes this, that if it were required that he sacrifice daily, he would have done it. On the hour, Lord, do you need me to sacrifice? I will do it. But you're not pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. He knew that he had to work on himself. He had to work on that part of man which cannot be seen, to please the God whom also could not be seen. David understood that it was not the external that would be pleasing. It was not the external that could get him out of the situation that he had put himself in. But it was only work with the internal that could put him in right relationship with God. He goes on to say in the 51st Psalm, he says, do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Notice this. He says, do it on your terms, God. He trusted in God for the deliverance. He trusted in God for righteousness. He trusted in God for mercy and justice and faithfulness. How difficult would this have been for David to be the king of Israel? He wanted a sign to know, God, you've restored them. God, you've protected them. I've let them down. But he puts his trust in God and understands this, that in the Lord's time, Israel would be restored and protected again. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices. After I have trusted in you, after I have a broken and contrite spirit, then I can offer the sacrifices. And brethren, at times we think if we'll do it and we'll do it and we'll do it, it'll be pleasing to God. But what God says, you are wasting your time in service to me if your heart is not in it. And too often we demand of others that if they don't start doing it the right way in the way that pleases us, then they can't be right with God. All along, we don't know what's in the heart of man. We don't know how broken that heart is, nor that spirit is. And therefore, we have no right to be in the seat of judgment on them. We, as David was patient with God, have to be patient with others as they work out their own salvation with fear and trembling. Because we can't ask that you sacrifice and you sacrifice and sacrifice and then it'll be right. David understood that. David understood that there had to be a monumental change within him before he could be pleasing to God. He says after that change has been made and I've put all trust in you, then you will delight in sacrifices and in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. Their trust was twisted. And then we have to answer this question before we look at the weight of the matter is, what about the hypocrisy of it all? Who was the audience? Do you remember the audience? The well-read, the religious elite, God's people. And if you didn't think they were, just ask them, they'll tell you. Their actions, all that they did. Who did they want to receive the glory? But yet you say you're doing it in God's name? Who benefited from their sacrifice and what they did and their service? Who benefited? They did. And you're going to say, no, Devin, look, they tithed. They gave that away. Please. Have you ever kept up with their corruption that they had? All that went to the temple, they made sure it came back to them in some shape, form, or fashion. It worked unto their good. All the while, who was neglected? How Jesus opened this up when He turned it from the audience and the disciples, and He turned it to them. He said, you've shut the door of the kingdom to those whom you come in contact with. The hypocrisy of it all is they could not reach God, nor could those who they had a communication with reach God. The hypocrisy of it all is they were supposed to be those who were inviting people to God, yet they were shutting the door in their face. And so, they had made religion something that it never intended to be. And it became all about them, their title, and nothing about God. And that's the hypocrisy of it all. A group of people that was supposed to be so inviting, merciful, just, were neglecting all of that. They neglected the weightier matters. Turn your Bibles, if you would, to Romans chapter 10. The weightier matters. It's been pointed out this month, not the more right. And it's not this concept, you do one and neglect the other. It's not that. But here's what Jesus himself said. One is more difficult than the other. And we're going to observe that. One was more difficult than the other. But you also got to put this in perspective of who they were. In their dress, it was different than the dress of those around them. The scribes looked different. The Pharisees looked different in their dress. When they got up in the morning and put on clothes, they were thinking about their religion. Their scheduled prayers that they had, their scheduled visits to the temple, their schedule revolved around their religion. All of their produce, what they were making, their herb gardens, their lambs and their sheep, revolved around their religion. And their friends revolved around what? Their religion. They were consumed with their religion. Yet Jesus is saying there's a piece over here that is much heavier and much more difficult to work with than what you've been willing to work with. Why is it the case? And you look at that group of people who were so good at practicing their religion and you say there's a more difficult pathway. How could you look at that group of people and say there's a more difficult pathway? Let's look in Romans chapter 10. And Paul writing to the church at Rome and having a heart bent towards those scribes and those Pharisees, the Jews. He has a heart bent in a similar manner of which Jesus had bent towards them in Matthew chapter 23. He says in chapter 10 of Romans in verse 1, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. I bear witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Wait a second, Devin, you're wrong. You posted up there and you said the scribes and the Pharisees knew the word better than anybody. Now Paul says they don't know. It was not according to knowing God. That's what he says. Their zeal for God was not according to knowing God. Their zeal for God was not according to a relationship that they had created with Jehovah God. It was created on a knowledge of the Word to which they had twisted to help themselves and keep up their resume, but they didn't know God. They didn't know the inner workings of God. They didn't truly understand His mercy, His justice, His love, His compassion, and His kindness. They had a zeal for God, but what? But not according to knowledge. They didn't know that about God, and therefore they could not reflect that about God in their lives. They had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge, for being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God, and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. They had a misguided knowledge. A knowledge that the end of what all they knew was to the exaltation of themselves. And Paul says this to them in verse 4 of chapter 10 in Romans, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Ouch. You mean that Torah that I read and I read? It was to the exaltation of Christ, and the end of all that was to Christ. It wasn't for the lifting up of me. It wasn't for the exaltation of myself. They had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And it wasn't that they had an intellectual capacity that was lacking, that they couldn't understand the Torah. They understood the Torah. They could read it. But they couldn't read it to its end, which was to the knowledge of Christ Jesus. So therefore they practiced with zeal, but not according to knowledge. Why was it heavier? I want to present to you that Romans chapter 12 tells us exactly why it's heavier. Let's have that question on our mind as we read a few verses from Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, Paul, what you mean is you need me to tithe more. I didn't ask you to tithe more. I asked that you give of yourself. The totality of who you are, give it in service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Change your mind so that you have a knowledge of who God is. And by the knowledge of who God is, your life will be transformed, and you will now allow that to come forth in your life and be understood by those around you because you have a true knowledge of God. Look at verse 9 of chapter 12. Verse 9 of chapter 12 in Romans says, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. These are the weightier matters. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Look at verse 16. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Live in harmony with one another. Have you ever been around the people I have to be around? Have you ever had to deal with the brethren I have to deal with? And you want me to live in harmony with them? I mean, let's think about that as he's made a musical reference there and you sing. What's more difficult for those of you who can sing? The solo performance? Or getting in harmony with everybody else? And that's why the harmony and those who harmonize and we listen to is so beautiful, because there's work in being harmonious. Sometimes you have to sing in an octave lower than you prefer because it sounds better and more harmonious. There's some give and take in the talents that you've been given so that you can sing harmoniously. So too in the local church, you've got to live in harmony with one another. And many of us have looked at that and said, nah, I'll go tithe. I'm going to go check on my herb garden. What you talking about? Live in harmony. Because I think about the concept of counting out a tenth of mint. That might smell pretty good, but the cumin, on the other hand, doesn't smell quite as good. And I'm counting out a tenth of it? You want to know why the Pharisees were really, really good at counting out a tenth of their herb garden? Because they didn't want any part of living harmoniously with one another. Which one's a weightier matter? Anybody has a capacity to count out a tenth of something. Kindergartners can count out a tenth of something. But you know what kindergartners have a hard time doing? Living harmoniously with one another, right? Showing mercy and justice. That takes true strength and true character. These are the weightier matters. And I think once we understand the magnitude of what they were being asked to lift, we can understand now why they said, oh, I'll go sacrifice. I'll go count out my herbs. Because it was a lot easier. Continuing on in verse 17, he says, repay no one evil for evil. You mean just in the church building, or are you talking like everywhere? It's the weightier matters. It's difficult. It's hard to do. But it's what we've been called to do. Give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. That takes mercy. That takes justice. And it takes faithfulness. It takes having a conversation with yourself every single day and deciding who you're going to be. All the while knowing that there's somebody right there inside of you screaming for you to be somebody else, because it's a lot easier. And the path that the Pharisees took was, they said, I'll go tithe because I don't want any part of the weightier matters. How long have we neglected some of the weightier matters in our lives? How long have we found that being pretty proud of the manner in which we worship and going to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, and that will do for our religion? Why would you ask anything else of me? Because, brethren, showing up is the easy part. But showing mercy, showing justice, and faithfulness is the weightier matters. And may we all be more resolved to do the heavy lifting every day. What stands between you and being right with God? Is it the fact that you've never tasted the mercies and the goodness of God? You've never tasted that because you've never been buried with Him in baptism and raised to walk in newness of life? Or is it that you know that you've walked in a manner that Jesus would call hypocritical? And you need the help and the prayers of the saints to get you back on course. Whatever it is that stands between you and being right with God, I pray that you would change that this morning as together we stand and as we sing.